This video is sponsored by Skillshare. In Warhammer Fantasy, the Orc lifecycle was pretty clear. Orcs release spores which take root and grow a new Orc beneath the ground. This still seems to be the case in Age of Sigmar, even though it isn't quite as clear cut. But regardless, the affinity between greenskins and fungus is still very apparent, and a quick flick through the Gloomspite Gits Army book will attest to that. With the new swamp-dwelling Orcs being released as part of Dominion, I thought that it would be a good opportunity to really push that symbiotic relationship with a conversion. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video, I'll be showing you how to build some Fung-Orks. This guide will be getting 3 dead animal bits out of 5, as there are a few components from other kits needed, as well as a good amount of sculpting required. I began by removing all the components required to build a gut ripper before cleaning them up. Unusually for one of my conversion guides, I then immediately glued everything together. Normally, I'd highly recommend making adjustments to the components whilst they were still separated, but due to just how intricately these components go together, it would have been extremely difficult to make those changes and still get everything fitting together again afterwards. I imagine these Fung-Orks as having a symbiotic relationship with the mycelium that inhabits their swampy homeland. The Orc's body provides some mobility to better spread its spores, as well as a ready supply of nutrients. In return, the spore helps to improve the Orc's combat capabilities with a potent cocktail of hallucinogens and maybe a healing sap. This fungus would be situated across the gut ripper's shoulders, and I would begin by providing a little structure for them. I started off by drilling 2 1mm diameter holes across the shoulders. Into these I glued some 1mm plastic rods and then clipped down the length so that just a few millimeters were left protruding from the back of the Orc. Making these supports will provide just that little extra bit of structural integrity for the toadstools. As the rods are just there to hold things up, I needed to sculpt on some texture and detail. So I cut and mixed a small amount of green stuff. Once thoroughly mixed, I then applied a small amount of this around the rods and began to blend this around the rod and down towards the base. I was looking to create a sweeping taper here with just a small amount of the rod protruding from the top. Also, remember to use plenty of water or Vaseline here, as it will help to prevent your tools and fingers from sticking to the putty and will leave you with a much smoother surface. Once done, I was left with just a stalk, complete with a little more shape and texture than I had before. However, it wasn't just the stalks that I needed some green stuff. I wanted to create the appearance of mud and moss that had gathered up across the Orc's upper body and head, and again this was created with more green stuff. To create this uneven surface, I rolled out small, irregularly sized balls and pressed them onto the model. I arranged more lumps around these to create something similar in appearance to a cobbled street. With a few of these lumps in place, I then began to blend them together a little and also added some extra texture. Small bumps and divots were added to create that look of fresh mud and mossy patches. For a little extra detail, and to reference exactly where the fungus gets its nutrients from, I decided to add the remains of one of the gut ripper's unfortunate victims. I took one of the cracked skulls from the Citadel skull set, which meant that I could shoehorn in 8 dead animal bits into this video. I clipped away the back half of the skull to reduce its profile a little, and then trimmed up the edge to remove any stray pieces of plastic. Once prepped, the skull was then carefully pressed into the still fresh green stuff. While a little of the green stuff had formed over the edge of the skull, I wanted it to look a little more enveloped, so I added a few more green stuff lumps around it. When working with green stuff, you often find that you have to take breaks in order for the green stuff to cure. So whilst I had some putty mixed up, I decided to work on creating the mushroom caps. I began with an offcut of plasticard. The size and thickness doesn't matter though. I just wanted a smooth, slightly bendable surface to work on. To this, I then added some lumps of green stuff, one for each mushroom cap. These were then blended out into a squat cone shape and left to cure overnight along with the rest of the putty. Once they'd hardened up, I could remove the caps from the plasticard. They will have a little grip to them, but shouldn't be hard to remove so long as your surface was smooth enough. However, I wasn't done with the caps just yet. I still need to sculpt the underside, so these were placed bottom up onto a lump of blue tack, which would serve as a handy holder. Onto these undersides, yet more green stuff was added. I started with a small lump, which was then smoothed out and spread out to the edges. Don't worry about blending things together though, as that small lip around the edge will simply add to the effect. To this flat surface, I then scoured a series of lines emanating from the center point to create the gills. This was then repeated on the second mushroom cap before I allowed both to fully cure for a few hours. After hardening, I then drilled a 1mm hole into the center of each of the caps, taking care not to drill all of the way through. This hole was then used to anchor that small protruding piece of plastic rod from the stalks using some super glue. Now, of course, if you didn't want to go to the trouble of sculpting your own fungus, you could instead dip into one of the many Gloomspike Git sets. There are plenty of mushrooms and other fungus that you can clip away and use instead. But if you'd rather keep the costs down, then sculpting your own is the way to go. Continuing with the fungus theme, I next decided to add a couple of those flat, shelf-like tree fungi to the shield. Instead of using plastic rod supports, I started off with a sheet of plasticard. From this, I cut out a couple of rough semicircle shapes and rounded out the edge a little with a file. Attaching these perpendicularly to the shield surface, however, would be extremely difficult, and even if they did stick, they'd break off pretty quickly. So I decided to create some anchor points by sawing two roughly parallel cuts into the edge of the shield. The cuts weren't quite wide enough to allow the card to be slotted into them, so I widened them out a little bit with my knife. With the cuts expanded out a little, I then glued the semicircles into place. After giving the glue a chance to dry, I then added a little green stuff to both the top and bottom sides. These were smoothed out, and I formed a taper so that the cap grew narrower as it grew towards the edge. I also added gills beneath them as well. With the fungus on the shield and across the shoulders completed, I next wanted to really push the idea that the fungus is physically part of the orc, and to achieve this, I started out with one of the branch type pieces from the Sylvaneth Dryad set. I clipped this down and cleaned things up a little so that a few spurs were left and the end had been flattened. This root was then glued so that it appeared to be sprouting out from the right side of the orc's chest. This was then repeated with another root just around the back, which completed this fungus-infested orc. All that's left to do before painting was to glue the orc to its base and add a little variation in the surface height with yet more green stuff. I smoothed this out into a few small bumps, which I would add to later on. With the base and conversion completed, I could start to get some paint down on the model. The first step in any painting process is priming. This important first layer creates a uniform colour to paint up from, which is especially important when your model has green stuff and plasticard stuck to it. But in addition to this, it also creates a much better surface for your paint to adhere to. For this step, I chose to use a mixture of Vallejo Black Surface Primer and Grey Primer to create a dark grey mixture. While I applied this through my airbrush, the method that you choose doesn't matter. Be it aerosol, airbrush or brush on, it doesn't matter. Just make sure you achieve a full and even coat across the whole model. Once this was done, I left the primer to dry fully for at least an hour or so before beginning to add some colour. To paint this model, I decided to start off with all of the base coats first. It's quite an intricate model, so getting the messier steps out of the way nice and early means I'm less likely to paint over my completed areas. I began with the skin, as this covers a large proportion of the model, and for this I used some Rakarth flesh. I want a very pale flesh tone for this orc, and this paint is perfect for it. However, before applying the paint, I decided to thin it down, which is something that I also did over my base coat throughout this video. The mixture I created was roughly 1 part paint to 1 part water, and this would allow me to apply the paint much more easily and also in a couple of thin layers, allowing the paint to dry fully between each application. This creates a much smoother finish than if I just applied 1 coat, and for lighter paints like this is especially important. Continuing with the base coat and that same thinning and layering technique as before, I then moved on to painting the cloth. I wanted to use plenty of drab, earthy tones on this model, and for the cloth areas, I decided to use the faded green of Deathcore Drab. To paint the wrappings around the legs, waist and arms, as well as any areas of bone in the model, I chose to use some Steel Legion Drab. For a nice earthy brown colour that I could use to paint both the wood and shaft of the spear, the roots and soil across the Orc's back, I settled on Catachan Flesh. When it came to the metal areas of the model, I wanted everything to look corroded and rusty, which is perfectly understandable when you consider the swampy environment where they are kept. To start things off here, I gave the metal parts of the shield, spear and the small armor pieces a base coat of Rhinox hide. Finally, for the base coats, I moved away from the earthy colours that I'd used so far. To paint the mushrooms sprouting from the Orc's back and shield, I wanted something that would stand out against the warmer tones, and so I chose to paint them blue. This brighter colour was started off with an all-over base coat of Stegodon Scale Green. With all of the base coats completed, I had a good starting point for adding shading and definition to the miniature. I began with the skin, and as it was already quite fair, I chose to add some shading. But first, I created a mixture of the original Rakkar flesh with a little Galvorback red to create a faded dark pink. I also heavily thinned this down to create a much more translucent paint. Once mixed and thinned, this was applied to the recessed areas across the flesh. The first layer was very subtle adjustment in tone. The slight reddish colour is not only started to build up those shadows, but it also helped to sell the fact that these areas were flesh and not just cloth. The second layer was applied and a little more deeply into the recesses and would help to smooth out the transitions between the lighter and darker areas. But most important thing to remember here is to keep your layers thin and allow them to fully dry before adding more paint. With a similarly thin consistency as before, I then applied some pure Galvorback red. This was focused into just the deepest recesses and would result in a much more strongly defined shadow. With the Galvorback shadows complete, I then finished off the skin with some of the very pale skin tone, Pallid Witch Flesh. This was applied as an edge highlight. I carefully dragged my fine-tipped brush along those raised details, creating much brighter points on the model that would contrast nicely against the shadows. After completing the skin, I then began to apply the same shading and highlighting principles to other parts of the model. The first of these were to the cloth areas. I began with a mixture of Deathcore Drab and Rhinox hide. Using Rhinox hide here instead of black helped to maintain a little more saturation of the colour and also gave it a warmer tone. This was thinned out and directly targeted into the recesses to add some of that subtle shading. More targeted shadows were then created with just some pure Rhinox hide. I then proceeded with two edge highlights. The first was Strachan Green, and this gave the edges of the cloth a slightly faded and torn look to them. This was furthered with some small dots of Ogre and Camo, which were used to pick out the corners where two edges met. I just applied a small dot to these, which created a much sharper appearance and further separated the details from the shadows. For the areas that I base coated with Steel Legion Drab, I just needed some thinned Rhinox hide and painted this directly into the recessed areas. I didn't worry too much about being as subtle with my transitions here, as these particular areas were much more strongly textured and detailed, so you can go ahead and paint this directly in. The light tan strands were then finished off with an edge highlight of a Shabti bone. Moving on to the wooden and muddy areas of the model, I once again started out by applying some Rhinox hide as shadows, which were then picked out with some Night Quester flesh. This was applied in a couple of ways. For the spear shaft, I carefully picked out the rough grain of the wood. However, for the softer, less defined mud across the shoulders, I instead opted to just apply small spots of the paint to the highest points. The next areas to tackle were the rusty bits of metal. The Rhinox hide base coat that I had applied to these areas gave me all the shadows I needed, but I still had to build up that orangey rust colour. For this, I chose some rat skin flesh and thinned it out in much the same way as my earlier base coat. This was applied to the metal areas, but I kept the recesses as the Rhinox hide. This was especially important across the shield, where the details were in stark relief. I built this up over a couple of layers until I had some better definition. However, I wasn't quite happy with the orange hue of the rust. To fix this, I grabbed some of the contrast paint Griffhound Orange and heavily diluted it with some Lamium Medium. This mix was then painted onto all of the metal areas. This created a strong filter which retained the shading from the previous step but strengthened that orange tone. I finished off the metal with some very fine edge highlights of Luggenoth Orange. The final areas to paint were the mushrooms. As I've already said, I wanted to heavily contrast the warmer hues present on the rest of the model, so I really wanted to push the intensity of the blue here. I began with some Araman Blue and applied this in the same way as I tackled the shield. I picked out the raised areas but kept the shadows as the darker Stegodon Scale Green. It's not necessary, but I also created a little transition on the mushroom caps themselves, keeping the center peak point darker and slowly brightening out the blue towards the edges. I continued with the bright blue by adding a small amount of Baharoth Blue. This was focused mainly around the edge of the mushroom caps and to pick out some of the detailing in the stalks too. Finally, I added a thin layer of some Aethermatic Blue contrast paint to help harmonize the blue tone and to smooth out some of the blending from the last two steps. With the painting done, I then gave the model a coat of matte varnish. I applied this through my airbrush, but again, brush on or aerosol based applications are just fine too. The main thing here is that the paintwork is protected and some of the glossy sheen left behind from the contrast paint is dulled down a little bit. To finish off the model, I just needed a suitably swampy base. I decided to cheat here and use some of A.K.A. Interactive's Wet Mud. This is normally used to create mud splatters on your vehicles, but it can also be applied straight from the pot to a base. It will dry with a glossy finish, creating a wet mud effect. After allowing the mud to dry, I then used some of A.K.A. Interactive's puddles and added a few drops to the center. The green stuff created a depression here, which allowed the puddle to form within it. After completing the mud, I then superglued some moss and grass tufts to the raised mounds of earth. Now, before we take a look at the finished miniature, here's a little bit about Skillshare, the sponsors of this video. Skillshare is an online learning platform that offers you a whole bunch, thousands in fact, of classes that cover a vast range of topics, from illustration, design, photography and video to marketing, business analytics and leadership. When I'm not making YouTube videos, I work as a software developer by day, and both myself and my colleagues have found the courses offered in web development to be of great help. The JavaScript Toolkit by Chris Heilman is full of useful tips that are presented in an enjoyable format. It has been invaluable in helping me to brush up on my web development skills and keeping me up to date with the latest practices and technologies. Everything is done at your own pace. There is no pressure to complete classes within a set time frame. There are no ads to interrupt your learning, and there are new classes being launched all the time. It's a great way to make use of that extra free time if you find yourself with it. And the first 1,000 people to use the link in my description will receive 1 month free trial to Skillshare Premium. So, let's take a look at that finished miniature. And here we have the completed Fung-Ork. Orcs offer a great opportunity for the more unusual kinds of conversions. You don't need to be quite as serious, but the result still makes good sense when you consider how orcs are in the lore. So while I focus specifically on one of the gut rippers in this guide, you could easily apply the same modifications to other orcs, goblins, or even employ them on some 40k miniatures, maybe to create some alien fungus that's infected some hapless guardsmen. And straight away, that's another idea for a video. Overall, it was another good excuse to try out some of the new Dominion models, and I'm really happy with how this miniature turned out. I'm particularly pleased that contrast between the earth tones and the blue mushrooms. But as always, let me know what kinds of conversions you'd like to see me tackle in the future, and also let me know what you thought of this video. And with that, the final thing to say is a massive thank you to my supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Gustag Panzer, Jonathan Hart, Stuart Smith, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Jake, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Strand, Lyconian Primarch, Merrick, Mr. Grimm, Raphael Beiruthi, Nice OJ, and Swedsman. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links. Your help is what allows me to buy the kits required to build these kinds of conversions. And also, thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, which has allowed me to run it without any YouTube ads. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.